Hi, everyone, and welcome to my last module for AEP 855. This is for the case study and how I would go about handling the situation along with all the details. So, here's what's going on. The assistant principal, Richard Inman, has been trying to connect with students from the South Side. This is his first year as the assistant principal. So, of course, you don't want to step on too many toes, but you want to have a good founding relationship with the students. One particular student is the leader of the pack, and his name is James. James was tardy, and he was being called to Mr. Eamon's office to go about him being tardy so often and receiving his discipline for that. As he was heading into the office, James handed something to the or in a secretive way to another student named David. James's teacher was really suspicious of what was happening, feeling as if there was a drug interchange between James and David. Mr. Eamon then had the school officer escort David to his office as well. Whenever the boys were questioned together, neither one of them said anything to Mr. Eamon until David, you could tell he was on suspense. So then James spoke up and said that it was him who had he forced David to take the brass knuckles, or he threatened him with some violence. And even though as soon as that was happened, the officer, he didn't even, once he knew the brass knuckles were out, he didn't do anything, give any moment of recognition or anything like that. He just immediately handcuffed the boys and sent them on their way. James's mother, whenever Mr. Inman had talked to her, she wasn't even really concerned. Um, she's pretty much basically said it serves him right for acting the way that he did, being sent off to jail, I assume. Now David's mother, on the other hand, came in livid at Mr. Inman and did not want to do that. So flash forward after all of this happened, Mr. Inman has to fill out the report on James and David. However, James did admit that the problem was David's and not, or that the brass knuckles were not David's fault, that they were James's fault. So Mr. Inman takes that into consideration when filling out the paperwork for the DAEP program and does not fill out the paperwork on David. So then the board of secondary education comes in and tells Mr. Eamon that he is risking being held accountable and getting a written reprimand for not following the school board rules, technically. So while no person was physically harmed, there was both harm to James and David's academic lives. With Mr. Eamon involving the school officer, there was no room for a second chance and explanation by the students at all. Mr. Eamon regrets later by having a school officer because things could have been handled a little bit differently and the students wouldn't have been whisked off to jail. Now, while the school officer was abiding by the law of no prohibited weapons allowed on the school property, something to consider is how is this felony going to affect both of the 15-year-old boys in their futures. You're not able to apply to some colleges, jobs, or, people don't take you seriously if you have a felony on your record. So, in addition to the felony charge, the school has a zero tolerance policy that states that both James and David should be expelled for no less than 45 days and attend the DAEP. Mr. Eamon fills the paperwork out on James because this isn't his first offense of getting into trouble. However, he does not do so for David. Mr. Eamon wants to take into consideration how David has not been in trouble and how James has been, but he also wants to take into consideration how James stood up for David and came forward. Didn't really stand up, but he came forward with the truth, which is a big step for James. David just happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. So Big idea, big concept here. Mr. Eamon is torn between doing what is ethnically correct and what is lawfully correct when James bullies David into holding brass knuckles for him, and how the consequences could be lifelong. So here are the people that are involved. Here's what I know for sure. The people that are involved are James, David, Mr. Eamon, David's mother, James's mother, the school officer, the director of secondary education, and the teacher that reported the suspicious drug usage or exchange, I suppose. Um, the where we're at Rocket High, Junior High. We know that James is at the end. We know that he's in the DAEP, and then we know that most of this takes place in Mr. Eamon's office. So, at the beginning of the article, it says that the school has about 900 students. So, to me, that's a pretty big school. I graduated with 86 people in my class, less than 400 people total in my high school. So, to me, it's a big school. It's a public school. They don't say anything about the grade level that the boys are in or what type of programs they're in, if they're in any special education, if there's any language barriers. They don't say anything about the ethnicity of the boys, the demographics. They don't say anything about the school being how the condition of the school or exactly where it is located. So there are some possible outcomes. If David is written up, he could risk his future, his dreams, and his potential. So by doing this, it could really harm him and how he perceives himself as well as academically in the future. By Mr. Eamon not writing David up as he did James, he faces the possibility of being given the official reprimand, which will then go on his personal file. So Mr. Eamon also had started making a really big impact on James's life and establishing a relationship with him. And by James having to go to the DAEP, this could set him back to his old ways and habits because Mr. Eamon had even said that it had been a while since James had been in any type of trouble. So looking back at the information that was given, we don't really know how the parents are reacting in the situation, other than James's mom just saying, "Well, serves him right," and David's mom being livid. We don't know how they are reacting after the final sentencing. We just know how they're reacting whenever the initial situation happened. Um, and then my other thought is how are the other students viewing this? How is the student or how is the teacher viewing this? Are they viewing the decision to should they both be treated equally? Should one be treated differently than the other because of past and things like that? Now, while I feel like there is enough information in this to make a decision, I do wonder if there is some additional information that I could be missing that I just haven't thought of. So, what are the options? I came up with four. The first thing to do would be nothing. It's beyond my control at this point, and um, whenever it comes to laws and things along those lines, it's not in the assistant principal's hands anymore. The second thing could be that James could testify on behalf of David and his innocence so that David's not expelled, and then Mr. Eamon is not required to give him, um, not required to write him up so he's not doing what he's supposed to be and not given the reprimand. They, the third thing is they could give James another opportunity to work through his issues, such as counseling instead of the DAEP program, and sending him there. And then the fourth option would be James and David could work together on a community project after school and learn how to work against each other or work with each other, not against each other. So here's my pros and cons of all of my possibilities. So with option one, the solution, it doesn't rest on your shoulders anymore. So therefore, you don't have to worry about it, kind of thing. If you don't ethnically care, I suppose. The con to that is the relationship that you've had with both students could now be jeopardized. They're not going to trust you anymore if you're not going to stand up and fight for them. Option two, the pro to that is that David um, does not get sent to the DAEP or expelled, and then Mr. Inman doesn't recognize or doesn't jeopardize his career. Option option two, the con of that is that James still has to go to the DAEP. Option three, the pro to it is that um, James could learn from his mistakes that um, know that second chances don't always come around. He could better himself and learn, like, I'm not going to let this happen again. Option three, con, would be that James thinks that he can get away to bully a kid and and it could happen again in the future. And things could go back to being bad down the road. The pro in option four is that James and David develop a friendship and are able to provide a positive support for one another throughout the rest of their school years together. And then option four, the con to that though, is that one of them could do all of the community service while the other one just kind of goofs off. So the winner of my decision that I feel like is the best is actually a combination of choices two and four. In assessing the situation, we not only want to ensure that all parties are treated fairly at the current time, but we also need to consider the long-term effects and how the situation could have an impact. So, the plan of action that I have. So, seeing as how the situation got out of hand rather quickly by involving the officer, I would bring in both parents as well as the students and discuss what the options are. If James really was telling the truth and that, him and David both say David was not responsible for this, then David should not be held accountable for his actions because it wasn't his actions. He was forcefully told to do something in threat of being harmed. So if James testifies to that and is able to you know say, I forced him to do this, I would give James and David the opportunity to work together on a school project or a community project around the school, such as picking up trash, painting, mowing, janitorial type things, whatever could help them work together. I would then communicate to James though that this is a one-time deal. Like, this is what's going to happen. You cannot do this in the future. If it is, then we will go straight to the DAEP, and there won't be a second chance. And I would also notify the Board of Secondary Education that in the case of what's happened, there was misunderstanding, there's miscommunication. That this, I know the students the best, and if we choose to reprimand them the way that is written, it's going to have a bad outcome for all students. And by them, we have to acknowledge the fact that James did stand up for David, and not really stand up for David, but James did. Um, he didn't pinpoint that it was on David. He was willing to take the blame, and he was taking responsibility for his actions. And to me, as the assistant principal, as James is coming from the South Side, that's a huge step. And it's not something we want to backtrack on. So that all needs to be taken into consideration. Um, Again, if this doesn't work, which I feel like it will very strongly, I would resort to just option two, where James has to go to the DAEP. However, I would not punish David for being in the wrong place at the wrong time because to me, it's not an ethical choice. And I don't want to set him up for failure for his future. I hope you all appreciate it and see my side. I look forward to seeing everyone else's points of view in this case study. Thank you.